Hello, gentlemen. I have relocated in my porch, and by the way, but interesting videos. I have made a list of a very long number of things I need to cover, and I'll see if I can do this quickly. This might be difficult, but I want to start with dispelling a myth. And there's this myth I think that perpetrated by Fox News in particular, that spending money, government spending money, is a bad thing for the economy, is that it brings the economy down. And by the way, here's a little opportunity for me to just splurge my political beliefs. Splurge? I don't think that's the right word. But anyway, that's not true. When the government spends more money and has a deficit, that helps the economy. That's called, what is it called? Expansionary fiscal policy. Yes, expansionary fiscal policy. Because when you borrow money and you spend that money, that's money that just goes back into the economy, and it's real money. So that helps. Now, granted, there's a thing about long-term financial responsibility, where you can't just have deficits over and over and over again, because people will eventually stop loaning you money, and then you go bankrupt. But governments, luckily, don't have to deal with that for a long time. Interesting note. In my opinion, one of the most fiscally irresponsible presidents was Ronald Reagan. Like, what? Conservative. I know he had a bad economy to start with. But then he had a good economy and kept running up the deficits. And if you look at a graph of debt as a percent of gross domestic product, during the Reagan years it goes up. When he had a good economy, that makes no sense. Next thing. Let's see. Getting back to the spending brings the economy down. A thing that's going on in Greece right now is people who have loaned the Greek government money are essentially saying, we don't think you can pay this money back. So they have a debt crisis. And they had to do something called an austerity plan. Austerity meaning that they essentially have to go on a diet. And what the investors who hold Greek government debt are saying is that you have to get your government spending in control to make us convinced that you're actually serious about paying our money back. Okay, so first, from my understanding, and I don't know if this is absolutely true, but I think Greece was relatively irresponsible with its finances. Just my understanding. But there's something that I really, really disagree with in this whole conversation, is that some people say that this proves that this is the end of the welfare state. Side note. Welfare state meaning that the central government of a country has money reserved for, like, education, retirement, healthcare, unemployment insurance, maternity leave. That's a welfare state. The United States has a very, very, very small welfare state compared to other Western countries. But anyway, the crisis in Greece and other countries does not prove that the welfare state doesn't work. Because the example I hold up, once again, and this will happen many times, Sweden. Sweden has one of the most developed welfare states in the world. One of the most generous, most generous and biggest. But they're not having debt problems. Why? Because they were fiscally responsible. So, it's possible. And actually, if you look at during the 1990s and 2000s, Sweden's debt as percent of GDP went down. That's good, because that means that you have less debt to pay back relative to your wealth. So it's possible. Sweden has a very, very big welfare state and isn't in fiscal trouble. Which actually brings me to a point that Adam made about the health of the economy. And from my understanding, the standard economic thought says that a healthy economy is one that is growing, and growth is good. Now, I disagree with this, because as Adam said, there's lots of other things that are perhaps more important, like, are people eating? Do people have health care? Good things. And happiness, too. That's, good, we think. But yes, there is actually something called gross national happiness, or gross domestic happiness, one of the two. But instead of saying gross domestic product, which measures the monetary value of all finished products produced in one country in 1 year. Gross national happiness measures how happy people are. It's a little subjective, so it's kind of hard to say how good those measures are. But what's interesting is that being a wealthier nation makes it a lot easier. Some of the happiest countries are still some of the wealthiest. But there are other really good measures of well-being for the health of an economy. Actually, standard good health of an economy is low unemployment, so that nobody is excluded from the workforce, and low inflation. So that means you have stability. So that means everyone has work and you have stability. Now that's just straight up economic health. But things I look at are things like poverty rates. There's a difference. There's absolute poverty and there's relative poverty. Absolute poverty is you do not have like access to food or shelter or water, as in you can't afford basic physical needs. That isn't really the problem in developed nations like the United States. A very, very, very small percentage of people in the United States and Europe are in absolute poverty. That's the extreme poverty that we hear about in like Africa and Southern Asia, for example. But the poverty that we have to deal with in the United States is relative poverty, and that's actually just a measure of inequality. And this isn't quite exact, but the best definition I've heard is to have few enough personal resources such that it excludes you from society. So think about in the United States. It's kind of hard to have a job if you don't have a car. But you live in the United States and you have a car. So if you're poor, how can you afford a car? Because you have a car. That costs thousands of dollars. That's more than a family in some country in, I don't know, Africa makes in a year. And if you have a car, then how are you poor? Well, maybe it's a very bad car that it gets lots of maintenance, and then because you had to buy the car to get the job, you couldn't afford food for a week. Well, maybe not a week, maybe a day. But you get to the point where you have a wealthy enough society, and that even the poorest people can buy a car, but they have to buy that car, so that there are other things that they can't buy that actually makes them excluded from society. So just because we're a wealthy nation doesn't mean that poverty is solved. And that's what relative poverty is all about. And in my opinion, a healthy economy not only needs low unemployment and stability, but you need to have low relative poverty, which means equality. And then there's also the happiness thing, but it's kind of hard to measure happiness in economics. From an economic standpoint, the most you can do as far as happiness goes is give people work, give people their living needs, and have some sort of social equality and stability. And once you've got that, economists are done. They got no more work to do. You're up to psychologists and sociologists now. Final two thoughts. Chinese food. You know what, Adam? If I were to make a bet that China has very diverse diets across the country, because those are indigenous people that have lived in China for their entire lives. Whereas the United States, we're a relatively young country. People who live here haven't had their ancestors here for a very long time. So we've kind of grown up together, whereas China maybe hasn't grown up together the whole time, and they had their own regional diets and cultures and dialects, where that doesn't really exist in the United States. I'm not sure exactly. Now, as far as Chinese food as we see it in America, which I really doubt is like what they eat in China. I mean, it's like here you fry chicken until it tastes like rubber, and then you fry rice and put that on top, and then you maybe fry some vegetables, so they're essentially not vegetables. And then that's Chinese food, but it's Chinese food across America is essentially the same thing all across America. There's a common theme. But I really, really doubt that's what Chinese food is like. So it's kind of hard to gauge, oh, well, Chinese food is different in New York than it is in California, so therefore it must be different across China. I don't think that works, but I don't think that's what you were doing.